Okay, today's daf is Daf Yud, Masechet Yoma. We're going to start at the second line from the top. We spoke about why the second Beit HaMikdash never had a complete manifestation of Shekhinah. And it said because it was built by the Persians, not by Bnei Shem, not by the people not by Semites, if you will. So so how do we know that the Persians come from Yefet? Tichtiv, as it says, Bnei Yefet, Gomer, Umagog, Umadai, V'Yavan, V'Tuval, Umeshach, V'Tiras. This is a list of the sons of Yefet. So Gomer, who's Gomer? Germamia, this is Germamia. Magog, Zokanadia. We don't really exactly know what these regions are. Madai, now according to the Bach, it should say Madai Kemashma'o, that Madai is what it means, Madai, Media, and Yavan Zo Macedonia. That's what it should say. It's Macedonia, because we know Greece, right? So that's what it should say according to the Bach. Tuval ze Bet Onyaki. This is another place, Bet Onyaki. Meshech zo Mosia. We don't know exactly again what these places necessarily correspond to on our maps today, but Tiras, Paligiba, Rabbi Simai v'Rabanan, v'Amila Rabbi Simon v'Rabanan. Rabbi Simai and the rabbis argued about what Tiras was. It's definitely not corn. Okay, it's a place. So they argued about that, and some say it was Rabbi Simai, and some say it was Rabbi Simon and the rabbis. Chadamar zo Bet Taryaki. Some say it was the house of Taryaki, or Bet Taryaki, wherever this place says, Paras, and some say this is Persia. Tani Rav Yosef taught in the Baraita, Tiras zo Paras. According to Rav Yosef, in the Baraita of Rav Yosef, Tiras is Paras. But what does that show you? That Persia is from Yefet, because one of the children of Yefet was Tiras. Okay, so that shows that Persia was from Yefet. Savta v'Rama v'Savtecha. So what is Sava? What is Savta, Rama v'Savtecha? These other places. Tani Rav Yosef, Sakistan Gavaita, v'Sakistan Baraita. There were two places. Savta and Savtecha were actually the same place, but one was called the outer Sakistan and one was called the inner Sakistan. Sakistan Gavaita means inside. Sakistan Baraita means outside, like a Baraita. It's something outside of the Mishnah. So Sakistan Baraita is the outside. Ben Chada Lachada Mea Parse. There were 100 parsaot between the outer and the inner Sakistan. Vehekefa Alfa Parse. And there was 1,000 parsaot in circumference. So it was like a city within a city. So you had the outer Sakistan, 100 parsaot, and the inner Sakistan inside. It talks about the first kingdom of Nimrod was Bavel, ve'erech ve'akad ve'chalne. Okay, Bavel kemashma'a. Bavel is talking about Babylonia. Okay, ve'erech za orichut. This is orichut, another place. Ve'akad. Okay, ze bashkar. So this is telling us the names of these places in the contemporary terms. In other words, they are taking the terms in the Bereshit and translating them into their map. Okay? Kalne ze Nofer. Okay? Nofer Ninfi. This is Nofer Ninfi. Okay, so this is a place that they knew in their time. Mina arta hiyatza Ashur. It says from this place came Ashur. Tani Rav Yosef, Ashur ze Silek. Ashur in the Bible is what they called in the Talmudic times Silek. Vayiven et Nineveh ve'et Rechovot Ir ve'et Kalach. It says he built Nineveh, Rechovot Ir, and Kalach. Nineveh kemashma. Oh, Nineveh is Nineveh. We know that place. Rechovot Ir zo Prat de Meshan. This is Prat de Meshan. Kalach zo Prat de Borsif. That's Prat de Borsif. So these are all just what they're doing is they're taking these terms in Bereshit that describe all the different nations and just giving them their contemporary names according to how the rabbis of the Gemara understood them. Bet Resen ben Nineveh ben Kalach. Here Ira Gedolah. And Resen between Nineveh and Kalach. So Resen was a place between Nineveh and Kalach. Here Ira Gedolah. This was the great city. Resen ze Aktisfon. So Resen is a place that was called in the times of the Gemara Aktisfon. Hiya Ira Gedolah. It says that Resen was between Nineveh and Kalach. It was the big city. Hiya Ira Gedolah en yodeh im Nineveh Ira Gedolah im Resen Ira Gedolah. Which one is it saying is the big city? Nineveh or Resen? Which one? When it says in the book of Yonah that Nineveh was a great city to God, which took 3 days to walk across. We learn from there that Nineveh was the great city. So this is geography, Talmudic geography here. Vesham achiman sheshai v'talmai yilidei ha'anak. So now we're talking again about different regions in the land of Israel, in particular. And it says that there was, and this is talking about when the Meraglim came to Israel, there was Achiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the children of the Anak. Okay? So this is what it says. Now, what is Achiman? Tana. So Tana Achiman miyuman shebachim. Achiman was called so because he was miyuman. He was the most skilled. In this case, it means the strongest of the brothers. Sheshai. Shemesim et haaretz kashchitot. That he would make the ground like pits. Why would he make them like pits? Because he was so strong, he was so big, that when he would walk on the ground, he would make holes in the ground. Okay? That's why he was called Sheshai. Why Talmai? Because Shemesim et haaretz tlamim tlamim. He would make furrows in the ground when he walked. He was even more burly of a guy. Davar acher, according to the commentators on the side, the word davar acher should be erased, according to the Gra, and also according to the Hagaot Tabach, there should not be the words davar acher. Another thing here, it's just going on. Achiman bana anat. Achiman built the place called Anat. Sheshai bana Alush. Sheshai built the place called Alush. Talmai bana Talbush. And Talmai built a place called Talbush. Yilidei Anak. They were called sons of the Anak. Shema Anikin Hachama Bekomatan. Why were they called the sons of the Anak? Because they pierced the sun with their height. In other words, according to Rashi, Domesh Tzavaron Nokev Ve'ole B'Chalon Arakia. It looks like they're so tall that it looks like their neck penetrates the sky. Okay, like they're driving a dagger into the sky with their height. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, Amar Rabbi, in the future, this is a little bit scary given our current global situation. In the future, Rome is going to fall into the hands of Paras. Shneimar, as it says, what should it actually say? Asher Ya'atz. El Edom, right? That listen to the word of Hashem or the advice of Hashem that He has counseled about Edom or Machshevotav, Asher Hashav, and his thoughts that He has thought El Yoshevei Teman, about those who dwell in Teman. If they're not going to be destroyed by the Tzirei Atzon, the young of the sheep. Okay, this is what the pasuk says. So in other words, they're going to be driven out, or they're going to be dragged out by the young sheep. Im lo yasim alehem nivehem. Im lo yashim, alehem nivehem. If he's not going to ruin their dwelling place for them. In other words, the young sheep are going to ruin the dwelling places of Edom. Edom is Rome. Okay, and the young sheep are being interpreted here as a reference to the Persians. In other words, that the Persians are going to destroy the dwelling places and drag out all of the Romans, according to the pasuk. Matkifla Rabbi Bar Ula. How do you know? Asked Rabbi Bar Ula that the young sheep here is a reference to Paras. How do you know it's the Persians? Dichtiv, as it says, are you saying that because it says in the pasuk and the exact pasuk is on the Ha'ayel Ashera'ita Bala Kiranaim Malchei Madayu Faras is the pasuk, right? That the isle, the ram that you see with the horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, so in other words, ram or sheep, same thing. A sheep is just a young ram. A ram is just an adult sheep. So it's the same thing. The Persians are called the ram in the vision of in the vision of Daniel. So therefore, it makes sense that we would consider the Persians to be the sheep here that are displacing the Romans. Ve'ema Yavan, but maybe we can say it's Yavan. Because it also says that the large Sa'ir, the goat, is the king of Greece, the king of Yavan. So how do you know when it says that the sheep are going to drive out, the tzon are going to drive out Edom? Maybe tzon can mean sheep or goats, right? Tzon can be both, the flock, sheep or goats. So how do we know that it's not Greece that's going to drive out the Romans? When Rav Chaviva bar Surkeme went up to Israel, he said this in front of one of the rabbis. In other words, he told over this question that was asked in front of the rabbis. Amarle, he said to him, could somebody who doesn't know how to explain Pesukim really raise an objection to Rabbi? How could he do that? How could he presume to disagree with this teaching of Rabbi, that Rabbi said, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself said, that the Romans are going to fall into the hands of the Persians, and you think you can read the pasuk better than he can? How could you do that? No! You don't know my tzirei atzon, because it says that tzirei atzon, the young of the flock, are the ones who are going to capture the Romans. And zutra dahoy, which means the younger of the brothers. Okay? And in other words, what it means is tzirei atzon, So the young of the sheep is not a reference to it could not be a reference to Yavan. It could not be a reference to the Greek king, because the Greek is called Sa'ir. It's called the goat. We're talking about Tzirei the young one, and we know that Tiras, that we said earlier on this Amud, Tiras is Persia. Tiras was the youngest. It was the last one on the list of the children of Yefet. Tiras is Persia. So if it says the youngest, it must mean not Yavan, because Yavan is not the youngest of Yefet. The youngest of Yefet is Tiras, which is Persia, according to what we said earlier. So that's the way that the Gemara answers. That's why we're saying it's the Persians. Right? Titani Rav Yosef, Tiras ze Paras, because Rav Yosef said that Tiras is Paras. Amar Rabba Bar Bachana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba Bar Bachana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eli, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Eli. Atida Rom ishtipol biad Paras. We know that Rome is going to fall into the hands of Paras. Kal v'chomer. It is a kal v'chomer. Uma mikdash rishon shebnei bnei Shem. Because if the first Beit HaMikdash that was built by the Bnei Shem, the sons of Shem, v'charivuhu kasdiim, and the Babylonians destroyed it, naflu kasdiim biad Parsiim, the Kasdiim fell into the hands of the Persians. Mikdash sheni shebena'u Parsiim v'charivu Romim. The second Bet HaMikdash, which was built by the Persians and destroyed by Romans, enodin sheyipelu biyad. Where am I? I missed a line. Enodin shepilu romim biad parsim. I skipped a line, right? Sheyiblu romim biad parsim. So in other words, if the Beit HaMikdash that was built by the Jews and was destroyed by the Kasdim, it was destroyed by the Babylonians fell into the hands of the Persians. So certainly a Beit HaMikdash built by the Persians, destroyed by someone else, should also fall into the hands of the Persians. In other words, the Persians are the cleanup crew here. They're always the ones that are coming last. So if a Beit HaMikdash they had nothing to do with, those who destroyed it fell into their hands, then a Beit HaMikdash that they actually built, then those who destroyed it should also fall into their hands. Kal v'chomer. Amar Rav says, Atida Paras shetipol biad Rome. You know, it's the opposite. Paras is going to fall into the hands of Rome, and believe me, today they're hoping that this one is right. Right, with everything that's going on in Iran today. Right? Amru le Rav Kana Rav Asi the Rav. Rav Kana and Rav Asi said to Rav, how could you say that? Banuye biyad sature. Could it be that the ones who built the second Beit HaMikdash are going to fall into the hands of those who destroyed it? How could the destroyers prevail over the builders? Amar lahu, he said to them, yes, gezerat melechi. Such is the decree of the king, that the Persians will fall into the hands of Rome. Chada de satre bekinishta. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped. Some say Amar, that it should say what? That Amar lehu, he said to them, Inunami kasatre bekinishta, that the Persians also destroyed many synagogues and therefore deserved also a punishment to fall into the hands of the Romans. Tani Namiyachi, we also learned in a Braita Atita Parashitipol biad Romi, that we learned that the Persians are going to fall into the hands of Rome. Chada de satre bekinishta, first of all because they destroyed lots of Batei Knesset. They destroyed many synagogues. And ve'od gezerat melecho, and it's also a decree of the king, sheyipilu bonim biad sotrin, because it's a decree of the king that those who built the Beit HaMikdash should fall into the hands of those who destroyed it. Ta'amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, because Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Ein ben David ba, ad shetifshod malchut Romi harisha'a b'chol ha'olam kulo. Because David HaMelech, in other words, the Mashiach is not going to come until the entire world comes under the hegemony of, what? Right, until the entire world comes under the hegemony of Rome, Tisha Chodashim, for 9 months. Shene'emar, as it says in the pasuk, and this pasuk comes from Michal, Lachen yitenem ad et yoleda yalada v'yeter achav yishvon al bnei Israel. It says, that's the full pasuk, that therefore he's going to give them ad et yoleda yalada, until the time that the one who's giving birth gives birth. In other words, for 9 months before the Jewish people are finally going to be redeemed. There's going to be 9 months of complete rule of the world by the evil kingdom of Rome. And we haven't seen that happen yet. That means that the Persians have to fall into the hands of Rome. Which would mean in our maybe global dynamic today that, the Middle East or something, the Middle East, China, I don't know how that would work today because we have more division of powers, and maybe we have more axes of governments than they had back then. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Kol lishakot shayu b'mikdash lo hayu lahen mezuzah. Now we get back to a little halacha here. So all of the chambers in the Beit HaMikdash did not have a mezuzah, chutz milishkat parhedrin, except for the chamber of parhedrin, which was where the Kohen Gadol would stay the 7 days of his preparation for Yom Kippur. Shahayaba bet dira la Kohen Gadol, because it had a room of dwelling for the Kohen Gadol, so therefore it was considered a bet dira. It was considered a dwelling place, and it required mezuzah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, "V'halo kama l'shakot hayu b'mikdash." But wait a second, there were many chambers in the Bet HaMikdash hayalahen bet dira that had places for sleeping or resting or living. V'lo hayalahen mezuzah, and they still didn't have a mezuzah. Ela lishkat parhedrin gezerah hayta. Rather, the reason why the chamber of Parhedrin had a mezuzah is not because it had a dwelling, because it had an apartment in it. Because there were other chambers that also had apartments in them. But it was for a gezerah. We'll see what that is later. My tamad Rabbi Yehuda. What's the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that none of the chambers actually require a mezuzah. None of them. It's a gezerah for some reason that we put a mezuzah on the chamber of Parhedrin, but really none of them require. What's the reason? Amar Rabbah, it should say, Kasava Rabbi Yehuda holds kol bayit she'eno asui limot hachama ulimot hageshamim eno bayit, because he said that any house, any place that's not for all year round living, it's only for winter or only for summer, doesn't require mezuzah according to Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, he would say that none of these, even the Lishkat Parhedrin, even the chamber of Parhedrin where the Kohen Gadol is going to live for 7 days, it's not a full bet dira. It's not a place that's going to be used in winter and summertime. And therefore you don't need a mezuzah, even if it's temporarily used here and there for sleeping or for some kind of living quarters.
That's why technically you don't need a mezuzah in a synagogue.
Well, that's for another reason. That's because it's not a bet dira. It's not for living in it at all. Right. It's a holy place. Right. So, there is an objection to this. I'm sorry, I skipped the part again. Why am I skipping today? Abai raised an objection. But it says, I will strike the house of the winter and the house of the summer. In other words, there's such a thing as a summer house and a winter house. So why does he say that in order to be called a house, it requires all year round use? Amarle bet choref ubet kayitz ikri, bayit stama lo ikri. We need something that's just called a house, not something that's called a summer house or a winter house. And these houses are qualified. Oh, it's only a summer house. It's only a winter house. That is not sufficient, says Rabbi Yehuda. It has to be a house which is going to be used all year round. Abai raised another objection. This doesn't make any sense. Sukkot echag v'chag Rabbi Yehuda mechayev v'chachamim poterin. That we learned that Rabbi Yehuda says the sukkah that you sit in on Sukkot requires a mezuzah. That's definitely not for year-round use. It's only for 7 days. And the Chachamim, poterin, the Chachamim say no. V'tanei alam, we learned about it. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev be'eruv uvimzuzah uvimaaser. There are three ways in which Rabbi Yehuda treated the sukkah as a real house. First of all, it requires eruv, meaning that we learned in Masechet Eruvin that if there are multiple dwellings open to a single courtyard, that they all have to participate in the eruv in order for carrying to be permitted. What about a sukkah? What if there are houses in the chatzer and somebody puts a sukkah in there? He doesn't live there, but he puts a sukkah in there. Is that sukkah considered a home in the courtyard such that that person living in that sukkah should be required to contribute to the eruv, to participate in the eruv? The answer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is yes. And b'mezuzah, the sukkah of Sukkot requires a mezuzah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And b'maaser, there's a rule that tithing of produce. Let's say you have grain that you brought from the field, you're allowed to snack on it without taking maaser. However, once you bring it home, once it's ro'eh et penei habayit, once it comes up to the front door of the house, now you're not allowed to take and eat from it at all unless you take the maaser. That's the rule. So he said that if you bring it to the sukkah, it's also a house. You bring your grain into the sukkah, it's a house also. So now, maybe you'll say that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't really hold that any of these things are required. It's only rabbinic. You could tell me that he requires a mezuzah rabbinically for the sukkah. It's not really a house, but midrabanan. You could tell me that eruv, since eruv is already a rabbinic thing, they also included sukkah as a house in Hilchot Eruvin. However, but you can't impose a requirement of maaser midrabanan. Why not? Turning to Amud Bet, dil ma'atel afrushe min hachiyuv al hapatur umin hapatur al hachiyuv. Because we're very careful about not saying something is obligated in maaser unless it really is. Why not? Because you can only take maaser for something from produce that's obligated in maaser. However, if I take something that's really not obligated in maaser, and I combine it with things that are obligated in maaser, I can't take from the patur ala chiyuv. In other words, I can't take from the stuff that really doesn't require maaser to cover my obligation for things that do require maaser. So we can't mix them. Because you might end up taking apples that do require maaser, and I'm just making up, whatever. Potatoes, apples, let's say whatever the food is that does require maaser. You might combine it with things that don't require maaser, and you'll take those apples that didn't require maaser to begin with, and they don't count as maaser. You can't designate them as maaser. It won't cover your obligation for the apples that do require. So we're not going to say, oh yeah, the sukkah creates an obligation of maaser, because that's going to be confusing. People are going to think, oh, this is totally chayav in maaser, so I can separate my maaser from these apples for all my other apples that are in my real house. No, the ones you brought in the sukkah, they can't count for the real house, because they're not really obligated, if it's only rabbinic. Therefore, what must we conclude? That Rabbi Yehuda means that the sukkah is really genuinely, biblically a house, with regard to mezuzah, with regard to eruv, with regard to everything, with regard to maaser, everything. And therefore, what does that mean? Lishkat parhedrin. Let's go back to the chamber. We can't say that when Rabbi Yehuda said, we asked the question, you told me that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require mezuzot in certain places from the Torah is because he says it has to be all year round dwelling. That can't be true, because he says that the sukkah min ha-Torah, the sukkah requires the mezuzah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Min ha-Torah. So from the Torah, biblically it requires it. So what are we going to do now? Is the sukkah definitely not for Yemot HaGeshamim? Right? It's only for 7 days. Ela amar Abaye, rather Abaye concluded like this. B'shiv'a dekulei alma lo pligid mechayiva. Everybody agrees during the 7 days it requires a mezuzah. Just like during the 7 days of Sukkot, Rabbi Yehuda requires a mezuzah. During the 7 days that the Kohen Gadol is in Lishkat Parhedrin, it definitely requires a mezuzah as well. Okay, however, ki pligeh b'shar yemot hashana. But with regard to the rest of the days of the year, there's a machloket. Rabbanan savri gazrinan shar yemot hashana atu shiv'a. According to the Hachamim, we say that since the 7 days require a mezuzah, we have to put a mezuzah the rest of the year. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda savar, lo gazrinan. Rabbi Yehuda says we don't make a gezerah like that. Yes, during the 7 days of Sukkot, during the 7 days of Lishkat Parhedrin, there needs to be a mezuzah. But we don't say that means the rest of the year you need a mezuzah on those doors. Okay?
But it's not the final...
That's not the final answer. Right? So far. Amar le Rava, Rava says, V'hasukat techag b'chag katani. What are you talking about, says Rava? That can't be right. The Chachamim don't agree that during the 7 days of Sukkot you need a mezuzah on the door of the Sukkah. They never said that. Why are you saying that that's the machloket here? It can't be. Rather, Ela amar Rava b'shar yemot hashana kulei amla pligid. Torah goes the other way. All year round, the other 350 days of the year, whatever. Actually, in the Jewish calendar, I guess it would be the other 347 days of the year. Okay, it doesn't require a mezuzah according to everyone. Ki pligi b'shiv'ah. The argument is during those actual 7 days, the 7 days that the Kohen is in the Lishkat Parhedrin, and the 7 days that the person is sitting in the Sukkah. That's where there's a machloket. Why? What is the machloket? V'sukkah ta'ama lechud, v'lishka ta'ama lechud. And the difference and the reason why you require a mezuzah by sukkah is different than the reason you require a mezuzah for the chamber. Why? Sukkah ta'ama lechud, Rabbi Yehuda l'tameh damar sukkah dirat keva ba'inan, u'mechayeva b'mezuzah, v'rabanan l'ta'amayu, ta'amrei sukkah dirat aray ba'inan, v'lo mechayeva b'mezuzah. In other words, they have a machloket regarding the sukkah of Sukkot. Why? Because on Sukkot, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and this is brought in Masechet Sukkah, which God willing we'll learn not too long from now, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the sukkah dirat keva ba'inan, which means that the sukkah must be a permanent dwelling. The roof has to be temporary, but the structure has to be permanent. Therefore, it also requires a mezuzah according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim say dirat aray ba'inan. By definition, the sukkah is good enough if it's only temporary, and therefore it doesn't require a mezuzah according to the Chachamim, even during the 7 days of Sukkot. Okay? However, v'lishkat ta'ameh lechod, and when it comes to the chamber, in the Beit HaMikdash Lishkat Parhedrin, there's a different reason. Rabbanan Tavrei Dira Bal Korcha Shema Dira. According to the Chachamim, Dira that you're forced to do is also called Dira. In other words, even though it's not voluntary, the Kohen Gadol has no choice. He has to go there. It's still called dwelling. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Dira Bal Korcha La Shema Dira. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, Dira that's against your will is not called Dira. It's not called dwelling. Now, what does it mean? It's not called dwelling. In other words, according to the Chachamim, Me'ikar Hadin, you must have a mezuzah in Lishkat Parhedrin. Why? Because it's a chamber for dwelling. It's dwelling that's only against your will. It doesn't matter.
But why is it against his will?
Meaning he doesn't have a choice. He's not voluntarily saying, I'd like to move into this apartment for a few days. He has to, halachically. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no, since it's not choice, since it's not voluntary, really it wouldn't require a mezuzah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Me'ikar hadin, it wouldn't require a mezuzah. But everyone agrees it does. The question is why? According to the Chachamim, Me'ikar Hadin, the basic halacha requires it, because even though he doesn't have a choice whether to go live there or not, the bottom line is he's going to live there. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the fact that he's not going to live there of his own volition means that halachically really it doesn't require a mezuzah. However, they made a gezerah. What's the reason? Umidarabanan hu ditakinula. The rabbis made this institution of a mezuzah. Why? Shelo yomeru Kohen Gadol havush bevet asurin. So it won't look like the Kohen Gadol is being put in jail. Right? It looks like they're putting him in jail. He's being sequestered in jail because he's a bad guy. It doesn't look nice. And as the Tosafot says in the bottom, he's saying that about the sukkah, but the same concept. In other words, it's a gnai. It is it looks negative on the Kohen that he's living in what seems to be like a prison, so they put a mezuzah in there to say, no, it's a respectable dira, it's a respectable dwelling place. Who is the author of the following statement of the rabbis? As we turn to Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Kol HaSharim Shayu Sham Lo Haya Lahem Mezuzah Chutz Mishar Nikanor Shelifnim Mimenu Lishkat Parhedrin. All the gates that were in the Beit HaMikdash did not have a mezuzah except for Shar Nikanor. Why? Now, according to the Gra on the side, it shouldn't say Shar Nikanor, it should say Shar HaMayim, within which was the Lishkat Parhedrin. Okay? In other words, since it led into Lishkat Parhedrin, which itself had a mezuzah, it too had to have a mezuzah. Lema Rabbanani, this seems like it must be the rabbis speaking, because Velo Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda. De'i Rabbi Yehuda, hi gufa gezerah, va'anen nekom, v'nigzor gezerah l'gzerah. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, hi gufa gezerah. It's already a gezerah that we're making, putting a mezuzah on the door of Lishkat Parhedrin. It's already a gezerah. It really doesn't require it, Me'ikar Hadin. And now we're going to go even further and make another gezerah. We're going to make a mezuzah on the opening of the Shar HaMayim, or the Shar Nikanor according to our Girsah, but the Shar HaMayim according to the Gra. We're going to put a mezuzah on the door. Why? Because Lishkat Parhedrin has a mezuzah. Why is that? Because maybe people will say that the Kohen Gadol is being put in prison. It's already too many maybes. Too removed. Gemara answers, no, same answer it usually gives. Afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda, you can say even according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's no problem. Kula chada gezerahi, it's all one gezerah. In other words, they gave, if you look at it as that they just decided to put a mezuzah on the Lishkat Parhedrin.
One gezerah with many reasons.
It's one reason, which is that they don't want the Kohen to look like he's going into a prison. But if they only put a mezuzah on the door of Lishkat Parhedrin alone, it wouldn't accomplish the full purpose, because you would see it's arbitrary. Why doesn't the gate also have a mezuzah? If it's really going into a dwelling place, we have to put it there too. In other words, it's all part of, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would all be part of the same gezerah. That in order for the Kohen to seem like he's not going to prison, the situation has to look like a respectable dwelling. A respectable dwelling means not only is there a mezuzah on the door going right into the chamber, but also on the door of the gate. And therefore it's kula chada gezerah, it's all one gezerah with two parts. One is to have a mezuzah on the door of the Lishkat Parhedrin, the other one is to have a mezuzah on the door of the gate. So it's the same thing that you find in many places in Masechet Cholin, for example. Nikanor, or according to the Gra, it was Shar Hamayin. Same concept as, let's say, for example, you're not allowed to eat you're not allowed to eat chicken and milk. Why not? Because you might eat meat and milk. So the Gemara asks, well, can you bring chicken and milk to the table and eat it at the table, at the same table? In other words, you're eating a cheese sandwich, I'm eating chicken. So it said, no, you can't do that. Why? It's only a gezerah. Maybe I'm going to take some of your grilled cheese, you're going to take some of my chicken. And it's already a gezerah to eat, you're not allowed to eat chicken with milk. That's a gezerah. How many gezerot? It's too many steps. Gemara answers, Kula chada gezerahi. It's all one gezerah. In other words, once they said that we're going to treat chicken and milk like meat and milk, if we tell you can eat it at the same table, it won't accomplish the purpose of sending the message. So sometimes the gezerah can have multiple parts, but it's all really one gezerah.